The Appalachian Trail stretches over 2,000 miles of staggering beauty, but beneath the quiet rustling leaves, something truly sinister walks. For every breathtaking vista, there is a horrifying, unsolved mystery tucked into the woods. Some hikers make it out changed, others, disturbingly, don't make it out at all. Tonight, we are stripping away the picturesque postcards to uncover the chilling realities of the AT. Here at Dark Untold, we've collected 9 of the most disturbing, verified incidents, tales of mysterious disappearances, encounters with genuine predators, and events so strange they defy explanation. Prepare yourself, because once you hear these true stories, you will never look at a solo hike the same way again. Hit the like button, subscribe if you dare, and tell us which story shocked you most in the comments below. The air in the Blue Ridge was a heavy, cold draft, smelling of damp earth and rotisserie smoke from a distant, forgotten campfire. Detective Elias Thorne didn't need the medical examiner's nod to know this was the 4th. 4 victims in 7 months, all found within 50 miles of the Appalachian Trail, yet each discovery site was uniquely secluded, requiring a mountaineer's knowledge to reach. This victim, Sarah Jenkins, was different only in the sheer brazenness of her placement. She lay half-buried beneath a cascade of shale and rhododendron, visible only because the recent rain had washed away a protective layer of mud. Thorne knelt, ignoring the rising bile. The killer didn't just murder them, he processed them. The nickname, assigned by the panicked media filtering rumors from the state police perimeter, was cruelly accurate: the Trailside Butcher. "Elias, don't touch anything yet," Dr. Lena Reyes cautioned, her voice low and clinical despite the grotesque display before them. Reyes was a forensic anthropologist from UVA, possessing the unnerving ability to read death like a textbook. Thorne straightened, brushing pine needles from his worn canvas jacket. "He's escalating, Lena. The first 2, they were cleaner, swift kills, deep cuts to the jugular, almost surgical. This is something else." Jenkins's body had been meticulously disassembled, not hacked or dismembered in a frenzy, but sectioned with the terrifying precision of someone filleting a carcass. Key muscle groups removed, bone structures exposed. Crucially, nothing had been taken from the site, no trophies in the traditional sense. The killer was creating a display, or perhaps disposing of waste. "Look at the uniformity of the cuts around the scapula," Reyes said, pointing with a gloved finger. "This isn't kitchen knife work, Elias. This is specialized, likely a curved breaking knife, used in large-scale animal processing. He knows anatomy better than most surgeons, specifically relating to yield and separation." Thorne scanned the perimeter. The killer was invisible, no footprints other than theirs. The rain had ensured that. He struck only when the trails were empty, typically midweek, during the low season. He chose victims seemingly at random: a solo female hiker, an elderly birdwatcher, a pair of young college students camping illegally, and now Sarah Jenkins, a local realtor who had been jogging a known loop. The lack of a unifying profile terrified the VSP more than the brutality. "He's not targeting demographics, Lena. He's targeting opportunity," Thorne muttered, pulling out a topographical map stained with coffee and frustration. "But where does he take them? He can't perform this level of workout here, exposed to the elements." Reyes pointed to a cluster of old, abandoned logging roads snaking eastward deep into the George Washington National Forest. "He needs privacy, light, and water. More importantly, he needs time, hours. He transports them, alive or recently deceased, to a secure location, performs the work, and then returns the remains to the trail system as a message." The investigation ground through weeks of fruitless canvassing. Every isolated cabin, every decommissioned hunting blind, every registered meat processor in a 5-county radius was checked. The local community, usually fiercely independent, was fracturing under the strain. Hikers vanished from the trails, tourism dried up. The mountains, once symbols of freedom, had become a cage of fear. Thorne felt the pressure building. His marriage had dissolved years ago under the weight of his job, and now the trailside butcher was threatening his sanity. He started sleeping in his truck near the command center, the scent of antiseptic crime scene cleaning fluid replacing the smell of home. Reyes developed a profile that chilled the seasoned detectives. The butcher wasn't driven by sexual sadism or financial gain. He was driven by purification and efficiency. His victims were rendered down, reduced to their essential parts. He was a collector of skills, applying knowledge perhaps gained in a slaughterhouse, or, disturbingly, in military deployment involving field autopsy. He sees people as livestock, Elias, Reyes concluded during a late-night briefing, and he's operating on his own schedule, adhering to an internal logic we haven't cracked yet. Thorne focused on the oldest case file, the college couple, Emily and David. They had disappeared near the Swift Run Gap. If the killer had a pattern of movement, that area was the geographic center. He overlaid maps of known trail usage with maps of abandoned structures and old fire roads. One location kept surfacing, a decommissioned, privately owned fire tower known locally as Vance's Peak. The land surrounding it was rugged, almost impassable by modern vehicle, serviced only by a crumbling track accessible via an old state park maintenance gate. Thorne gathered a small, tight team. They wouldn't announce their approach. They'd walk in under the cover of a false search party. They began the ascent at midnight. The mountain was a black, silent beast. The only sound was the crunch of their boots on the gravel and the heavy, rhythmic breathing of the four officers. Thorne led, flashlight beam low, cutting through the damp, heavy fog that clung to the lower slopes. They reached the clearing near Vance's Peak just before dawn. The old steel tower rose like a skeletal finger against the lightening sky. Beneath it, nestled in a thicket of overgrown hemlock, was a dilapidated, windowless woodshed. A plume of thin, acrid smoke curled lazily from a makeshift stovepipe jutting out the rear wall. "That's it," Thorne whispered into his mic. "Perimeter team, hold position. Jenkins and I are going in." The stench hit them first. A powerful chemical odor mixed with raw meat and something metallic, like stale blood. Thorne drew his sidearm, the cold steel feeling strangely small. They breached the shed door. The sight inside defied logic and sanity. It was not a cabin, it was a workshop. Fluorescent lights powered by a loud, sputtering generator illuminated stainless steel tables, drainage pipes leading into the dirt floor, and a chilling array of specialized tools hanging neatly on pegboards. Bone saws, various sizes of breaking and boning knives, hooks, and heavy-duty plastic sheeting. The air was frigid, kept cold by commercial coolers humming in the corner. And in the center, meticulously organized on a steel rack, were the trophies. Not personal belongings, but organs preserved and labeled in jars of formaldehyde. Thorne felt the sweat freeze on his back. The killer wasn't just butchering, he was documenting. A noise came from the interior, a shuffling, followed by the clatter of metal. "Police, show your hands!" Thorne bellowed, aiming for the back corner, which was draped in a heavy tarp. A figure emerged, not the hulking monster Thorne had envisioned, but a man in his late 50s, gaunt and wire-thin, wearing blood-stained work overalls and thick rubber boots. His eyes were wide and unsettlingly clear. This was Julian Vance, a man dismissed from the State Park Service 20 years prior for chronic insubordination and cruelty to captured wildlife. He had simply vanished into the mountains he knew better than anyone. Vance held a large, curved knife, reflecting the weak light. He didn't drop it, he didn't run. He smiled, a slow, horrifying stretching of dry lips. "You shouldn't have come up here, detective. Vance's voice was dry and even, completely devoid of emotion. "This place is clean now. I keep it clean." "Drop the knife, Vance. It's over." Vance shifted his weight, moving with the preternatural silence of a man who lives entirely off-grid. "Over? No, detective. The cleansing is necessary. Look at them. They bring their noise, their filth, their flimsy tents. They ruin the perfection of the stone and the forest. They need to be reduced, returned to the earth efficiently." The confrontation exploded in violence. Vance didn't charge Thorne. Instead, he threw a heavy ceramic bowl filled with an unknown caustic liquid, creating a cloud of blinding fumes. Thorne fired instinctively, the shot tearing harmlessly into the ceiling as Jenkins wrestled him back towards the door. Vance fled, not out the front, but through a small, camouflaged hatch in the rear wall, disappearing instantly into the dense woods. The team converged, securing the gruesome workshop. Thorne ignored the evidence for a moment, focused only on the chase. He knew the terrain was Vance's greatest weapon. The mountain was his ally. "He's headed towards the ravine system," Thorne radioed, already sprinting along the narrow, hidden trail Vance had obviously maintained. The chase was less a foot pursuit and more a battle against the terrain itself. Vance moved effortlessly through thickets of mountain laurel, jumping over fallen logs slick with moss. Thorne, weighted down by his gear and his exhaustion, struggled to keep pace. He heard a sickening, resonant snap ahead. Vance had likely tripped one of the almost invisible wire snares he had set. Thorne rounded a large granite outcropping and found Vance trapped, his ankle twisted at an impossible angle in a tight cable loop meant for deer. Vance didn't scream. He simply looked up at Thorne, his breathing fast but controlled, the butcher knife still gripped in his hand. "You're slow, detective. Too much weight," Vance gasped, trying to reach the knife to cut the wire. Thorne closed the distance, his sidearm steady. "It's finished, Vance. Drop the weapon." Vance stopped struggling. He looked past Thorne, towards the sunrise beginning to paint the peaks in false gold. "Do you hear the quiet, detective? When the animals are gone and the people are silenced, the mountain sings. I was just helping it sing louder." With a sudden, final burst of adrenaline, Vance lunged not at Thorne, but at the cable, attempting to sever his own trapped foot to escape. Thorne reacted instantly, bringing the butt of his weapon down sharply on Vance's wrist. The knife clattered onto the damp pine needles. The fight left them both sprawled and gasping. When backup arrived 10 minutes later, pulling Vance out of the woodshed and down the mountain, the rising sun revealed the true scope of the horror found within Vance's peak. Not just the 4 known victims, but evidence pointing to 3 others, long lost, consumed by the relentless silence of the woods. In the ensuing weeks, as the evidence was processed and the families finally found closure, the trails slowly reopened. Thorne stood at the trailhead where Sarah Jenkins had vanished, watching the first few brave hikers return. The mountain was beautiful, silent, and vast, but now, when Thorne looked at the shadow lines cast by the ridges, he didn't see peace. He saw the cold, sterile efficiency of the butcher's workshop, forever staining the Virginia wilderness. The predator was gone, but the lesson remained. The deep woods always hide their secrets well, and sometimes the monsters they conceal are wearing the face of solitude. The joy of the first mile was the sharp, clean scent of pine and damp earth, a relief that settled deep in Sarah's lungs. She was Sparrow on the trail, 27 years old, chasing solitude and the silent camaraderie of the Appalachian Trail's white blazes. This section, a planned 40-mile stretch through the unforgiving, densely forested spine of the Appalachians, was meant to be restorative. It was mile 3 when the first knot tightened in her stomach. She had stopped near a small cascade to refill her Sawyer filter. She remembered with absolute certainty leaving her hiking poles crossed neatly over her pack at the base of a maple tree. When she returned 30 seconds later, the poles were standing upright, jammed vertically into the soil like two skeletal sentinels. It was a subtle shift, too deliberate to be gravity. Sarah dismissed it as wind or perhaps her own absent-mindedness magnified by the silence. She pushed on, the trail winding tightly through rhododendron tunnels. She hiked hard, aiming to make 8 miles before noon. At her lunch spot, a rocky outcrop overlooking a hazy valley, the feeling returned, heavier this time. She had unwrapped a protein bar and settled in when she noticed a fresh cigarette butt, unfiltered, cheap tobacco, stubbed out beneath the same boulder she was resting against. It was still slightly moist. No one had passed her that morning. She was certain of that. If someone was ahead, they had stopped immediately before she arrived. This proximity was unsettling. Hikers passed, but rarely did they stop exactly where you intended to stop, especially not so close together. She packed quickly, the taste of fear overriding the taste of the chocolate. She picked up her pace, transitioning from a comfortable stride into a determined march. She passed mile 5, then mile 6. The temperature dropped as she ascended a steep ridge known locally as the Dragon's Tooth. Her breathing was ragged, but she didn't slow down until she reached a small, poorly maintained lean-to marked on her map as Oakhaven Shelter. She needed water but hesitated to stop. The shelter was empty, silent, radiating an age-old dampness. As she scanned the dirt floor, she saw it, a single, meticulously arranged pile of 3 small, smooth grey stones placed directly in the center of the wooden sleeping platform where one would lay a sleeping bag. It wasn't litter. It was a marker, a message. Sparrow didn't stop. She bypassed the shelter and forced herself another 1.5 miles down the trail, ignoring her aching calves. She found a small, hidden campsite 70 feet off the main trail, screened by thick brush, a spot she thought only she could find. As dusk bled into the deep blue of twilight, she set up her tent quickly, skipping dinner preparation for fear the smell would carry. She crawled into her sleeping bag fully clothed, headlamp off, listening. The forest sounds were normal. The rustle of nocturnal rodents, the far-off hoot of an owl. She was almost lulled into sleep when she heard the sound. 2 distinct, soft clicks like carabiners knocking together. The sound was coming from the trail, moving slowly, deliberately past her hidden position. Then silence. The sound did not recede into the distance. It simply stopped. He was waiting. Day 2 started before dawn. Mile 10. Sarah dismantled her camp with professional speed, not allowing herself the luxury of coffee. The air was cold and wet and visibility was low. She was moving solely on adrenaline now, knowing she was being hunted not by an animal, but by patience. She kept checking her 6, her neck rigid. She tried slowing, hoping her pursuer would pass her in frustration. She stopped to tie her shoe, intentionally taking 20 seconds longer than necessary, pretending to be distracted. Nothing. The moment she resumed her pace, a faint, snapping sound, like a twig underfoot, sounded precisely 10 seconds behind her, perfectly paced to avoid being seen around the trail's bends. He was mirroring her. He wasn't trying to catch her. He was establishing dominance through proximity. The next 12 miles were a blur of focused terror. Every white blaze, once a comforting confirmation of direction, now felt like a breadcrumb left for the predator. Around mile 18, she crossed a creek via a series of slick stones. She risked a glance back as she gained the opposite bank. She saw him. He was standing motionless, partially obscured by the mist rising off the water. He was tall, wearing a dull green fleece and a muted baseball cap, his backpack blending perfectly with the forest canopy. He wasn't charging or yelling, he was simply watching her. The most terrifying thing was his casual posture. He looked like any other hiker, except for the absolute stillness of his stance and the way his head followed her movements, slow and steady. She didn't wait to see if he would cross. She sprinted. Her pack suddenly felt like it was filled with lead. She ran for nearly a quarter mile until her lungs burned and her muscles screamed for rest. When she finally stumbled to a halt, leaning against an ancient oak, she pulled out her phone. No signal, of course, not a bar. She tried to rationalize. Maybe he was just a fast hiker. Maybe he was curious why she ran. But the deliberate placement of the stones, the standing poles, the mirrored pace, this was not random. This was intentional, tailored stalking. She checked her gear inventory frantically. Her small knife was easily accessible. She had bear spray, but she knew that at this distance, it was a defense of last resort. At mile 22, she reached a major trail junction, a wide, rocky clearing where several side trails converged. Here, the stalker left his clearest signature yet. Propped against the wooden marker sign was her water bottle, the one she had misplaced, or thought she had misplaced, back near the creek at mile 18. It was her distinctive blue Nolgene, and tied around the neck of the bottle was a thin strand of brightly colored orange paracord, secured in a professional nautical knot. He hadn't just found it, he had retrieved it, modified it, and delivered it. He knew she would need water. It was a gesture of mocking intimacy, a declaration that he controlled the flow of her necessities. He wasn't just following, he was tending to her like a farmer tending a trapped animal. She realized with a sinking dread that he hadn't just seen her face. He knew her gear, her habits, her vulnerability. He might even know her real name. She tossed the bottle aside. She couldn't drink from something he had handled, and plunged down the steep, secondary trail leading toward the next designated shelter, a place called Willow Creek. The sun began to dip below the ridge, throwing long, deceptive shadows across the forest floor. Sarah knew she was running out of time and daylight. She had to break the pattern of the blazes. She reached Willow Creek Shelter at mile 27. It was a large, dilapidated structure, mercifully empty. She didn't dare set up her tent. She forced herself to eat a handful of dried fruit and pulled out her headlamp. She was going to hike through the night. If she could reach the trailhead road, only 3 miles left before dawn, she might escape him in the darkness. She took a massive gulp of the precious filtered water she had left and started moving, the beam of her lamp bouncing nervously ahead of her. The forest at night was a different entity. All shapes were magnified. Every rustle sounded like a step. She was focused on the white blazes, her only guide, when she heard it again, the slow, measured sound of metal on rock, not far behind. He was moving slower now, too. He was playing with her. He knew she was hiking through the night. He had predicted her desperation. Mile 28.5. The trail opened up into a narrow, exposed section that ran along a steep drop-off. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She paused, extinguished her headlamp, and listened intently. The metal sound stopped instantly. Silence descended, heavy and absolute. Sarah waited for 5 minutes, breathing through her mouth to minimize sound. The cold night air prickled her skin. Then, from the darkness just 20 feet behind her, a sound that made her skin crawl. A soft, drawn-out sigh. The sound of someone finally relaxing after a long day's effort. It was too close. She fumbled for her bear spray, her hand trembling so violently she nearly dropped it. She pointed the canister blindly into the darkness. Stay back!" Her voice was a cracked whisper, swallowed immediately by the night. The sighing stopped. Sarah knew she couldn't fight him here. He was too close, and the drop-off meant she couldn't retreat quickly. She had to leave the trail. She turned 90 degrees to her right, plunging down the embankment. It wasn't a side trail, just a chaotic mess of briars, fallen logs, and thick ferns. She scrambled, sliding and tearing her clothes, ignoring the pain. She had to get away from the white blazes. The blazes led him to her. She heard him move, not a crash or a curse, but a careful, rhythmic descent through the underbrush, tracking her sound. He wasn't falling behind. She kept sliding, aiming for the sound of rushing water, a sign of a small tributary she knew was far below. If she could follow the stream, she could drown out her own sounds and confuse his tracking. After what felt like an hour, she landed hard on the muddy bank of the stream. She didn't hesitate. She waded into the icy water, moving downstream, the cold shocking her into a renewed clarity. She stayed in the stream for nearly half a mile, her boots saturated, her feet numb. She risked climbing onto the bank only when she saw the faint, grey promise of pre-dawn light filtering through the canopy. Mile 30. She reached the trailhead parking lot at 6:15 a.m. It was paved, cold, and blessedly empty except for her rental car. She threw her pack into the trunk, jumped into the driver's seat, and locked the doors, the key shaking in the ignition. She didn't look in the rearview mirror until she was speeding down the gravel road, the tires kicking up stones. She drove for 30 minutes before pulling over at the first gas station with enough light to feel safe. As she stepped out of the car, aching and exhausted, the memory of the past 30 miles crashed over her. She pulled her torn, muddy jacket off and tossed it onto the passenger seat. That's when she saw it. Resting neatly on the center console, where she must have accidentally left it when she drove up 2 days earlier, was her laminated trail map, detailing every planned stop, every mileage marker, every intended shelter, and secured to the map, held in place by a single, small, smooth grey stone, identical to the ones at Oakhaven Shelter, was a note. It was written in clean, elegant penmanship, one line only. "You should have kept the bottle, Sparrow. Hydration is important." She had broken the pattern of the blazes, but the stalker hadn't needed them. He had been guided by her own itinerary from the very beginning. And now he knew where she had been and where she was going next. Detective Elias Thorne hated the quiet of the high woods in winter. It was an unnatural quiet, heavy with the weight of frozen air and insulating snow, muffling sound until the only thing audible was the grinding ache of his own boots against the crust. He pulled his heavy wool collar tighter, the material smelling faintly of wood smoke and damp cedar. The temperature gauge in the SUV had settled at 8 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, a brutal, unforgiving January cold that turned breath immediately into glittering sharp crystals. The location was the Oakhaven Fire Tower, a skeletal relic of the 1950s that presided over the Blackwood State Forest. It was rarely accessed, especially now, buried under 3 feet of drift. The only reason they were there was the signal picked up by a lone hiker's drone, a faint, almost comedic image of a man sitting perfectly still on the observation deck, 70 feet above the frozen earth. Sergeant Reyes met Thorne at the base, his face drawn and pale despite the rugged beard. "Looks like a monument, Detective, perfectly preserved, like a statue carved of ice." The ascent was treacherous. The narrow metal stairs were sheathed in rime, each step echoing the hollow clang of industrial neglect. Thorne felt the vertigo not just from the height, but from the sense of intrusion. This tower was meant for spotting distant trouble. Now it was the focal point of a very immediate, very intimate trouble. They found him on the observation deck, huddled against the central support column, Dr. Julian Vance. He was a man of high repute in the fields of quantum mechanics and energy storage, a name Thorne vaguely recognized from financial news reports. Vance was sitting upright, his hands resting in his lap, eyes wide open, glazed over and opaque, fixed eternally on the vast white emptiness of the horizon. His expensive goose-down coat offered no defense against the deep freeze that had seized him. The interior of the glass-enclosed cabin was pristine, save for a thin layer of frozen condensation coating the inside of the windows. The small, heavy steel door, the only point of entry, was locked from the inside. A single key rested on the floor beside Vance's foot. "Suicide by exposure, Thorne?" Reyes asked, his voice low and reverent. Thorne ran a gloved hand along the perimeter of the doorframe, feeling the thick, punishing metal. "If it was suicide, Reyes, why climb all this way in this weather to sit and wait? Why not just drive off the mountain? And if he locked himself in, how did he manage to settle down so neatly before the cold claimed him? It suggests acceptance, Reyes, not struggle." Thorne knelt, examining the body more closely, careful not to disturb the frozen scene. Vance's skin was the color of slate, his lips blue-black. On the back of the victim's right hand, where the skin was drawn tight over the knuckles, Thorne spotted a faint, almost surgical puncture mark. Small, precise, the kind that disappears quickly in normal conditions, but which the deep freeze had suspended in time. "He didn't freeze naturally," Thorne stated, standing up and brushing snow dust from his trousers. "He was helped to this position. Someone brought him up here, locked him in, or made it look like he locked himself in, and let the elements do the rest." The investigation led them quickly away from the wind-whipped heights and into the sterile, humming labs of the Atherton Advanced Research Institute. Julian Vance was the chief architect of Project Chimera, an aggressively funded, highly classified cold fusion energy project rumored to be nearing a breakthrough that could reshape global power dynamics. Thorne's first official interview was with Maggie Vance, Julian's wife and fellow physicist, though she specialized in materials engineering rather than theoretical physics. She was tall, precise, and utterly devoid of visible emotion. She wore the grief of losing her husband the way she might wear a lab coat, professionally, defensively. "Julian and I separated 6 months ago, Detective," she explained, her voice steady as she sat opposite Thorne in a Spartan conference room. "We maintained a professional relationship. Chimera was our life's work, but our personal partnership ended." He was erratic lately, stressed about the final phase. "Did he have enemies, Ms. Vance?" "Everyone who stands on the verge of redefining reality has enemies, Detective. Financial rivals, governments afraid of disruption. But Julian wasn't careless. He was paranoid about security, both his and the data's." Thorne looked down at his notes. He was found sedated. A fast-acting benzodiazepine analog was found in his system. Not a lethal dose, but certainly enough to incapacitate him entirely and prevent him from seeking warmth or shelter. Maggie Vance's composure wavered just slightly, her eyes flicking toward the institutional clock on the wall. I wouldn't know anything about that. He had trouble sleeping. Perhaps he experimented with something new. The drug found in his system, Ms. Vance, Zolpidrex 5-beta, is highly restricted. It's an experimental compound used in deep-sea medical environments to induce controlled hypermetabolism. The only facility in this region that synthesizes it is the Atherton Institute's restricted toxicology lab, which you manage the administrative clearance for. A tense silence stretched between them, thick and cold as the air atop the fire tower. Thorne let the accusation hang. "Administrative access, Detective, not practical access," she finally countered, returning to her practiced calm. "Dozens of researchers passed through those labs. But only one had a motive to silence him, and the means to use an experimental sedative that leaves virtually no trace unless you're specifically looking for it. Thorne spent the next week dissecting Julian Vance's life, finding only layers of professional success obscuring a chaotic personal trajectory. The key lay not in who Vance was, but what he held. Project Chimera was the answer. It wasn't just about energy, it was about global control. Julian had recently realized the weapon potential of his discovery and planned to leak the full specifications, the dirty codes, to an international regulatory body, thereby neutralizing the inherent risk before any single nation could weaponize it. Thorne confirmed this suspicion when he found a heavily encrypted backup drive hidden beneath the floorboards of Vance's private home office. The metadata confirmed Vance had planned to transmit the data leak exactly 24 hours after his scheduled arrival at the fire tower. The fire tower. Why had Julian gone there? He returned to the Oak Haven site, the snow now deeper, the cold relentless. Reyes and the forensics team had missed something vital during their initial rush to secure the scene. Thorne ignored the gruesome memory of the body and focused on the physics of the structure itself. The door to the observation cabin was designed to be opened from the outside using a heavy wrench key, or from the inside by turning a large brass locking mechanism. The key had been found inside, next to Vance's foot, suggesting he had locked himself in, perhaps awaiting transport or a rendezvous. Thorne ran his fingers along the outer steel skin of the door near the latch housing. The metal was frozen, unforgiving. Then his gloves snagged. A thin, hair-width groove, almost invisible under the layer of frozen atmospheric soot. It was a recent abrasion, inconsistent with the weathering of the 50-year-old structure. It suggested a secondary device had been used briefly to manipulate the exterior locking bolt. He realized the scenario now. Julian Vance hadn't locked himself in to die. He had locked himself in to wait. He had arranged a meeting at the most remote, signal-isolated location he knew, preparing for his final, massive data transfer. A move he likely knew would make him a target. But the lock mechanism was designed with a simple fail-safe. If pressure was maintained on the external lever while the internal bolt was thrown, the internal key would turn, but the external lock would not engage until the pressure was released. Thorne arranged for Maggie Vance to be brought back to the base of the tower under the pretense of recovering her husband's personal effects. The weather had turned again, a cruel, biting wind howling down the mountain. They ascended slowly, Maggie Vance silent, wrapped in a coat that seemed too thin for the environment. When they reached the deck, the small enclosure felt like a pressure cooker of dread. "This is where he died, Ms. Vance," Thorne said, his voice flat, devoid of judgment or malice, simply stating fact. He wasn't here for solitude or contemplation. He was here to transmit the Chimera data, the data that, if released, would ensure the project became purely academic, denying its potential as a global weapon. Maggie finally looked at the floor, her breath fogging the small space. He was reckless, idealistic to a fault.
"And you weren't," Thorne pressed. "You saw the value, the power, the money. You saw the control. When he told you he was coming here, you didn't try to talk him out of it. You planned to stop him." Thorne pointed to the brass interior lock. He threw the bolt from the inside. He thought he was secure. But before he climbed the stairs, you were here, weren't you? You used the experimental sedative, the one you had access to. A quick injection. Enough to render him unconscious within minutes, before he could fight, before he could transmit the data.
Maggie said nothing, merely watched her own reflection in the frosted glass. "You then carried him up here, or guided his sedated body and set him down, posing him neatly. You then performed a specific piece of engineering, Ms. Vance. The exterior lock. Thorn pulled a thin, stainless steel shim from his pocket, the kind used by locksmiths, or perhaps an ingenious materials scientist. While Julian was unconscious inside, you used a tool, the one that left the small scrape mark on the frame, to keep the exterior latch depressed. That tiny pressure prevented the internal brass lock from fully engaging the mechanism. You threw the key inside, made it look like he was secured, and then you withdrew the shim. The lock snapped shut, simultaneously securing the door from the outside and leaving the key inside the cabin, simulating a lock-in from within. He was trapped by the very security he thought protected him. Thorn walked closer, his breath warm against the freezing air. "He froze to death, Maggie. Did you intend to kill him, or just stop him from pressing the send button?" Maggie Vance let out a shaky sigh, the sound dissolving instantly in the cold air. The professional mask cracked, revealing a deep, terrifying grief mixed with fierce, self-justifying logic. "I didn't want him to die," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "I wanted the cold to slow his heart, to hold him suspended until the transmission window closed. I planned to return for him, Detective, when the storm cleared, when the danger had passed. I would have saved him, but the blizzard came early, faster than any prediction." Her eyes lifted, not toward Thorn, but toward the endless white forest below. He was going to give away everything, the power, the future. He called it protecting humanity. I called it scientific sabotage. We built Chimera for the world, Elias, not for ethical grandstanding. The research was too important to be undone by one man's crisis of conscience. She finally turned to Thorn, her expression hardening again, though now infused with a desperate plea for understanding. "I only locked the door. The weather did the rest. It was the cold that took him, not me." "You applied the cold, Ms. Vance," Thorn corrected softly. "You used the deepest freeze you could access, and you locked the door to ensure the process was uninterrupted. You used the fire tower as a perfect refrigerated coffin for a secret too dangerous to keep." The wind outside howled, shaking the very structure of the tower. Thorn radioed Reyes. The confession was recorded, the mystery solved, yet the coldness of the act seemed to linger, clinging to the metal rails and the frosted windows. As Thorn escorted Maggie Vance down the treacherous, icy steps, the Blackwood forest seemed to swallow the light, growing darker and more ominous. The Oakhaven fire tower remained, a high, lonely sentinel guarding a secret that was frozen solid, encased in the scientific betrayal of a man and a woman who loved the future more than they loved each other. The research project Chimera was temporarily secured, now locked down by federal agencies. But Thorn knew the truth. Secrets, once discovered, are never truly contained. They merely wait, suspended in the ice, until the conditions are right for them to thaw and wreak havoc again. The tower confession was the end of one cold case, but perhaps just the beginning of a colder war. The sun, a furnace lid clamped over the Syrian desert, beat mercilessly upon the small caravan. It was 1888, and Dr. Alistair Thorn, an archaeologist whose ambition bordered on madness, had convinced a reluctant Jamal and his men to take the Darb al-Faza'a, the Trail of the Dread. This route, a withered scar on the earth running parallel to the established Damascus Road, was notorious. Not for bandits, which were common, but for something far older and less tangible. "We must maintain pace, Doctor," Jamal insisted, his face wrapped tight in a sand-stained turban, his eyes squinting against the shimmering heat. "The black sand section before the cistern is treacherous. We cannot afford the night there." Thorn, pale beneath a thick pith helmet, consulted his brittle parchment map. "Nonsense, Jamal. The accounts speak of the ruins precisely at the zenith of the Black Sands. Patience, glory awaits." Jamal spat dust. Glory, he knew, often arrived hand in hand with the horrors of forgotten history. This particular stretch of trail, whispered the locals, was cursed by the Karina, the wailing companion, whose grief turned men mad and whose voice stole the breath from the air. They had been traversing the desolate landscape for 5 days, the only sounds the creak of the camel saddles and the ceaseless grinding of sand under hoof. But on the evening of the 5th day, as the vast star-pricked darkness descended, the true isolation of the Darb al-Faza'a began to assert itself. They made camp near a cluster of jagged, wind-eroded rocks, the camels tethered and huddled. The men ate stale dates and tough bread in silence. Thorn was translating a fragment of cuneiform he'd found weeks earlier when Karim, a young Bedouin guard known for his stoicism, suddenly dropped his teacup. The sound was faint at first, a high, thin whistle carried on the desert wind, not the sound of the wind through stone, but a pressurized, agonizing sound, like air escaping a dying lung. "What is that?" Thorn frowned, dismissing it as geological. Jamal's head snapped up. His hand instinctively moved to the scimitar at his hip, though the sound was not human, not animal. It intensified. It was now recognizable as a scream, but filtered through immense distance and time, stripped of timbre, leaving only pure, crystalline terror. It was the sound of ultimate, unbearable pain, drawn out until the eardrums ached. Karim whispered, his eyes wide and fixed on the darkness. "The screams of the trail, they are hungry tonight." Thorn scoffed. "Superstition? It is the wind shifting through the ravines, an acoustic anomaly." But as the night deepened, the screams became specific. They were not generalized shrieks, they sounded like voices pleading for release, crying out names long forgotten. One scream, piercing and horribly close, sounded exactly like a woman begging for mercy in archaic Arabic, followed by a wet, final silence. The animals reacted first. The camels began to bellow, a sound of profound distress, straining their tethers until the ropes chafed. Jamal and his men spent the remainder of the night fighting the panicked beasts, drenched in cold sweat, while Thorn sat gripping his rifle, his rational mind warring violently with the undeniable, palpable fear radiating from the source of the screams. Sleep was impossible. By dawn, the sound had faded, replaced only by the blinding heat. The next morning, they discovered the loss. Musa, the older water carrier, was gone. His personal effects remained, his blanket, his water skin, but Musa himself had vanished without a trace, not a footprint indicating a struggle or departure. "Bandits would have taken the water, Jamal," Thorn noted, his voice strained. "Bandits leave tracks, Doctor. Bandits leave blood," Jamal replied, pointing to the undisturbed sand. Musa did not walk away. Something took him, and it did not move on the surface. The incident injected a profound fear into the remaining men. They refused to continue toward the black sands. But Thorn, driven by the belief that the ancient ruins he sought, the rumored city of Ash, were the key to the sonic phenomena, offered them double the payment and pressed the necessity of reaching the site before sundown. They pressed onward, the oppressive silence of the midday sun feeling worse than the cacophony of the night. They reached the black sands just as the air began to cool. The landscape here shifted dramatically. The ground was littered with fragments of dark obsidian glass and scorched earth, as if a localized inferno had swept through centuries ago. In the center stood the ruins. Not the grandiose stone city Thorn had imagined, but a circle of low, smooth basalt pillars, half-buried, forming a perfect, desolate amphitheater. Thorn was ecstatic. He recognized the geometric patterns carved into the stones, pre-Islamic Babylonian influences, utterly unique to this isolated region. As he began to brush sand away from the central altar stone, he uncovered a set of glyphs that chilled him to the bone, despite the heat. The glyphs described an ancient ritual of sustained sacrifice, not of life, but of sound. This site, they explained, was a spiritual battery. An ancient cult had imprisoned the agonizing final moments of a massive massacre, storing the terror and pain of the dying within the very rock, meant to be unleashed to disorient and shatter the minds of their enemies traversing the route. The ritual required the annual feeding of fresh fear to maintain the reservoir. Thorne realized the screams were not residual echoes. They were stored energy, and they were sentient, seeking replenishment. "We must leave this place, Doctor," Jamal cried, his composure finally broken as the sun dipped entirely below the horizon. The moment the last sliver of light vanished, the air turned instantly cold, a bone-deep, unnatural coldness that had nothing to do with the desert's natural temperature drop. The screams returned, no longer distant whistles, but a full, immediate auditory assault. They surrounded the camp, pressing in from all directions. They were loud enough to physically vibrate the teeth in their sockets. This time, the screams were personalized.
"Ibrahim!" a voice shrieked right behind Jamal, using the nickname only his mother had used. Jamal spun, drawing his blade, but saw nothing but the wavering firelight. Then the true horror began. The screams didn't just pierce the ears, they invaded the mind, manifesting specific memories of fear and suffering. Thorne stumbled backward, clutching his head, as he suddenly heard the last terrified gasps of his younger sister who had died of fever years ago, her face contorted in pain.
Kareem fell to his knees, clawing at his ears. He was hearing the pleas of his family during a raid years prior, the sounds overwhelming his senses until he rocked back and forth, sobbing incoherently. Thorne fought to maintain focus. He realized the epicenter of the sound was the central altar stone he had disturbed. The stone was now vibrating visibly, emitting a faint, greenish phosphorescence. "We have to destroy the stone," Thorne yelled over the din, but his voice was swallowed instantly by the roaring chorus of agony. Jamal, though terrified, was the only one still functional. Driven by primal necessity, he grabbed an iron spike used for tethering and sprinted toward the altar. The reaction of the phenomenon was instantaneous and savage. As Jamal raised the spike, the screams coalesced into a single, deafening, inhuman roar, a sound of pure rage and ancient power. The green light pulsed violently, and the air around the altar shimmered, revealing vague, fleeting shapes, skeletal figures, mouths locked open in eternal silence. Jamal brought the spike down with all his might. The metal shrieked against the ancient basalt. A sickening sound like grinding bone echoed through the sands. The green light intensified to an unbearable, blinding flash, and the screams vanished entirely, replaced by absolute, ringing silence. Jamal stumbled back, his eyes burned and watering, his ears bleeding. The altar stone was split cleanly down the center, the fracture running through the central glyph. The ensuing silence was heavy, oppressive, a void that seemed determined to reclaim the sound. When the men recovered, they found that Kareem was dead. He had died not from a physical wound, but from sheer auditory and psychological overload. His face was a mask of extreme terror, and blood ran freely from his eyes and ears. The Carina had claimed its final meal. Thorne, shaken to his core, looked at the fractured stone. He had found the source of the screams, and in doing so had released and then destroyed an entity that had been feeding on suffering for millennia. They abandoned the ruins immediately, leaving Kareem and the splintered stone behind. They rode east for 3 days without rest, ignoring the established track, driven by a desperate need to escape the Black Sands. When they finally staggered into Damascus, The bustling energy of the city seemed unreal, the normal noises of commerce and life sounding like a delicate symphony after the demonic cacophony of the trail. Thorne survived, but his rational arrogance had been replaced by a haunted quietude. He published no paper on the city of Ash. He never spoke of the nature of the screams, only referring obliquely to a psychological trauma induced by extreme desert isolation. But sometimes, when the wind blew just right through the narrow alleys of London, a specific frequency, a high, thin whistle, would catch the air. And Dr. Alastair Thorne would wake up in a cold sweat, clutching his head, convinced he could still hear the faint, lingering echo of the pure, bone-chilling agony stored in the rocks of the Damascus Trail, waiting for the desert to restore what he had broken. He knew the void of silence he had created was only temporary, and that the trail of dread would, eventually, find a way to scream again. Detective Marcus Thorne hated the meticulous efficiency of the wealthy. Ilara Vance's apartment, perched 30 floors above the perpetual gloom of Rain City, was a study in minimalist despair. Everything was exactly in its place, too perfect for a natural disaster, certainly too tidy for a sudden, passionate end. The call had been standard: apparent suicide, missing body. The door had been double-locked from the inside. Neighbors reported the faint, almond-scented air wafting into the hallway hours earlier, a clear signal of cyanide or a powerful barbiturate cocktail. The classic, neat way out. But when Thorne and his partner, Detective Lena Reyes, breached the apartment, there was nothing. No body, no overturned chairs, just the chilling residue of a carefully planned exit. "She's gone, Thorne. Clean sweep," Reyes stated, her voice tight with confusion. "If she took the pills, where's the resulting mess? Or the body?" Thorne was already at the lacquered mahogany desk, scrutinizing the centerpiece, the suicide note. It wasn't scrawled in panic. It was elegantly handwritten on expensive parchment, deliberately centered on the blotting pad. He put on latex gloves and carefully lifted the single sheet. It didn't read like a farewell. The raven waits for the 6th hour beneath the silent clock. Car's folly demands 3 eyes and the turning of the tide. I tasted the salt, but the sea remained dry. Sequence 47, 19, 3, 22. Ravenna remembers the weight of the lie. The key is in the mirror, but the reflection is flawed. Tell the tailor the stitches were loose. Thorne read it 3 times. This isn't a suicide note, Lena. It's a coded message, or the ramblings of someone deeply unbalanced. Ilara Vance was a systems analyst and a renowned architectural historian. Unbalanced, maybe, but never rambling, Reyes countered, reviewing the background files. She had no debts, no recent emotional trauma we can find. She was due to present a major paper on subterranean infrastructure next week. Thorne ignored the files, focusing on the note's text. The mention of Carr's folly resonated immediately. Elias Carr, a notorious, recently acquitted art smuggler who had specialized in faking historical infrastructure documents to illegally excavate valuable relics. Ilara had consulted against him in his last high-profile trial. "The key is the chronology," Thorne murmured, pacing the perimeter of the room. He pointed to the small, antique grandfather clock in the corner. It had stopped precisely at 5:53 a.m. The raven waits for the 6th hour. She left before 6 TR. This was timed. Forensics arrived and confirmed Thorne's suspicion about the scene staging. The smell of bitter almonds had indeed been present, but was generated by a small, timed dispersal unit hidden behind the desk, a theatrical effect designed to mimic a lethal gas or pill ingestion without the actual ingestion. Moreover, the locked door was a masterpiece of misdirection. A micro-servo controlled by a highly sophisticated miniature timer had been attached to the deadbolt mechanism, retracting the locking pin and then reapplying it once the door was closed. Someone walked out, then locked the door remotely from inside the room, after themselves, the lead tech reported, bewildered. It's like she disappeared through the wall. The investigation shifted from a death inquiry to a missing person case, but one laced with calculated deception. Thorne felt a rising frustration. Ilara Vance hadn't just vanished. She had performed an intricate illusion, leaving only a complex breadcrumb trail designed specifically for someone to follow. Reyes began the tedious process of decoding the sequence: 47, 19, 3, 22. They cross-referenced it with known ciphers, historical dates, and Ilara's financial records, finding nothing immediately obvious. Thorne, however, returned to the note's language. Ravenna remembers the weight of the lie. Ravenna was a city known for its intricate Byzantine mosaics. The reference felt historical, architectural, and visual. He pulled Ilara's extensive library records. She had recently checked out several rare texts on early Italian cryptology and, crucially, a monograph on the construction of the Basilica of San Vitale in Ravenna, a structure famous for its non-repeating geometric patterns and optical illusions. He realized the numbers might not be a direct cipher, but an index pointing to locations within a larger document. They located a dusty, leather-bound volume titled The Geometry of Silence, buried deep in a storage unit associated with Ilara. It was filled with her meticulous marginalia. Thorne found the corresponding entries for the sequence numbers. 47. A sketch of a specific drain cover pattern found only in the historic waterfront district. 19. A citation for a lesser-known poem about hiding secrets in plain sight beneath the tailor's stitch. Matching, tell the tailor the stitches were loose. 3. An equation related to atmospheric pressure and altitude. A photograph of a unique silver locket engraved with a single stylized raven, a locket known to have belonged to Ilara's mother and was now missing from the apartment. The combination was starting to form a terrifying picture. Ilara hadn't been escaping her life. She was escaping a threat, possibly Carr, and the note was a signal to someone else, or perhaps a challenge to Carr himself. Thorne focused on the drain cover pattern, 47, and the altitude equation, 3. Why connect a street drain with elevation? Reyes, meanwhile, tracked down Ilara's recent correspondence. 2 months prior, Ilara had received a highly encrypted email from an anonymous source concerning Carr's activities. The email contained a single attachment, a grainy satellite image showing a remote, newly developed oil rig platform off the coast. Thorne slammed his hand on the desk. The sea remained dry. Sequence 3, atmospheric pressure and altitude. She wasn't talking about dry land. She was talking about a platform above the water, an artificial island. Ilara's disappearance wasn't a sudden flight. It was the final stage of a long-term plan to expose Elias Carr's true operation, smuggling not just relics, but classified military technologies hidden within seemingly innocent architectural artifacts. Her knowledge of Carr's network had grown too dangerous for him to ignore. The cryptic suicide note was not addressed to the police. It was a fail-safe, designed to be confusing enough to delay Carr's cleanup crew while providing a clear directive to her only known confidant, an unnamed contact in the intelligence community. The mention of the locket, 22, provided the final key. The locket wasn't just sentimental, it was an electronic key fob, possibly containing the real evidence against Carr. Using the GPS coordinates embedded in the anonymous email and cross-referencing them with Ilara's recent, massive withdrawal of cash, Thorne and Reyes mobilized a covert marine unit. The offshore platform, disguised as a research station, was located roughly 50 miles out. When Thorne's team arrived under the guise of an emergency inspection, The scene was tense. They found Carr, surrounded by his heavily armed security detail, actively searching the cramped living quarters. Carr wasn't looking for Ilara. He was looking for the missing locket and the data it contained. He was furious that the suicide note had been so effective in fooling his own internal informants, delaying his arrival by nearly 48 hours. "Where is she, Carr?" Thorne demanded, weapon drawn. Carr sneered. The clever woman vanished into thin air, detective, just like her note suggested. As the confrontation escalated, a sudden, faint beep echoed from a nearby storage closet. Carr's men moved to investigate. Thorne recognized the sound. It was the same micro-servo mechanism that had locked Ilara's apartment door. He kicked the closet door open. Ilara Vance was not inside. Instead, attached to the inside of the door, was a high-powered industrial drone, now silently lifting into the air through a newly opened roof vent. Taped to the drone was the silver locket, the Raven Sequence 22. Thorne understood now. Ilara hadn't staged the note to escape. She staged the entire disappearance to lure Carr to a remote, monitored location while she used the distraction to ferry the evidence to a secure receiver, the true silent clock. The final sentence of the note, "The key is in the mirror, but the reflection is flawed," was the deepest cut. The initial suicide scene was a false reflection of reality. The real key, the locket, was hidden within the stagecraft of her own demise. As Carr's operation was swiftly dismantled, Thorne watched the tiny drone disappear into the grey horizon. Ilara Vance was not a victim nor a suicide. She was a ghost, a strategist who had leveraged her own fabricated death to deliver justice. Later, back in Rain City, Thorne received a thick envelope in the mail. No return address. Inside, a flash drive containing all the evidence needed to convict Carr, along with a small, perfectly preserved drawing of a raven perched on a high window ledge. There was no accompanying text, just a small, elegant postscript written in the corner. "The tailor has fixed the stitches." Marcus Thorne filed the flash drive and closed the case on the disappearance of Ilara Vance. Official reports stated that the body was likely lost at sea, an unfortunate casualty of a desperate act. The cryptic note remained classified, a silent testament to the woman who chose oblivion not as an end, but as a beginning. Thorne knew she was out there, having successfully traded her life for her freedom, having engineered the perfect, untraceable vanishing act. The woman who disappeared had won the silence she craved, leaving only the sound of the ocean and the unsolved riddle of her final exit. The deep green tunnel of the Appalachian Trail was Clara's sanctuary and her relentless master. She was 3 months into her northbound through hike, her trail name Sparrow, earned for her swift, slight movements and her ability to disappear into the shelter of the pines. Now she was deep in Maine, where the mountains grew rugged and unforgiving, and the trail narrowed into tricky, wet footpaths punctuated by sharp, unforgiving granite. The exhaustion was a heavy cloak, insulating her against the cold mornings but pressing her down with invisible weight. It was in the 100-mile wilderness, a stretch infamous for its isolation, that the stories began to take root in her mind. Other hikers had whispered them in the smoky closeness of the shelters, tales of a phantom through-hiker. Not a malevolent spirit, they cautioned, but one eternally lost, forever seeking a summit he could never reach. They called him the Trailblazer, a hiker who pushed through the season limits back in the late 70s, dressed in heavy wool and carrying a colossal external frame pack, determined to finish before the true winter slammed shut the path to Katahdin. He vanished near the Whitecap Peaks, swallowed by an early, furious snowstorm. His body was never recovered. Clara, a staunch rationalist, initially dismissed the legend as trail hype, the kind of psychological trick the isolated woods play on tired minds. But the atmosphere around her changed subtly. It started with the cold, not the predictable chill of an autumn dawn, but localized pockets of intense, static cold that clung to her back, even under the midday sun. Then came the movements. She'd catch a flicker of movement just beyond the tree line, a tall, gaunt figure in dull pine-green wool perpetually moving forward, gait slightly too fast, too strained. When she turned, the woods were empty. One evening, camping alone beside a dark, rushing river, she heard the distinct, rhythmic clink-clank of an old aluminum frame pack being set down, followed by a heavy, tired sigh. She froze inside her tent, headlamp off. The sigh sounded utterly defeated. She waited 10 minutes, heart hammering against her ribs, but heard nothing else. When she finally unzipped her vestibule and shone her light around, there were no footprints on the damp earth, only the perfect, undisturbed moss. Clara realized the presence wasn't following her. It was simply there. It was interwoven with the trail itself. The sightings intensified as she moved further north, closer to the final ascent. She began to recognize the spectral figure. He was tall, thin to the point of emaciation, his face gaunt and covered in a patchy salt and pepper beard. His eyes, when she managed to glimpse them through the fading light of the woods, were sunken and held an expression of agonizing, focused strain, as if he were perpetually fighting a headwind that only he could feel. His gear was antique, thick leather boots, heavy canvas gaiters, and a massive olive-drab pack strapped to a shining aluminum frame, the kind that screamed heavy just by looking at it. His clothes looked permanently damp, saturated with the smell of wet earth and pine needle rot that occasionally drifted towards her on the trail, distinct from the fresh air of the forest. His name, she learned from a brief, chilling episode, was Elias Thorne. She was traversing a particularly precarious boulder field when she slipped, scraping her knee badly. As she sat nursing the injury, feeling a wave of despair wash over her, a deep, raspy whisper seemed to scrape against her inner ear. "Push! Keep moving!" They closed the gates in October. The voice was filled with frantic urgency. It wasn't accusatory but desperate, a mantra repeated countless times in the crushing isolation of the late-season trail. Clara was no longer afraid, but overwhelmed by a crushing sense of pity. Elias was trapped in a perpetual state of forward momentum, unable to stop, unable to rest, forever chasing the white blaze markers that defined his unfinished quest. He was the definition of an anchorite soul, bound to the very path he loved. She decided against every ounce of rational thought that she had to try and communicate to break the loop. The next day, hiking through a dense stand of birches, she saw Elias standing clearly on the trail ahead, waiting. He wasn't transparent exactly, but looked like a photograph that had been left too long in the sun. The edges were blurred, the colors muted. Clara stopped, took a deep breath, and spoke softly, her voice feeling loud and crude in the silence. "Elias? Elias Thorne?" The ghost didn't turn his head. His focus was fixed entirely on the path ahead, towards an unseen summit. His hands, bony and stained, repeatedly adjusted non-existent straps on his pack. "Katardin is still there," Clara continued, speaking to his back. "You are close, but you don't have to walk anymore. You finished your journey a long time ago." Elias let out a noise, a low, pained groan that was less sound and more a vibration of cold air. He then took a deliberate step forward, walking straight through a thick birch tree as though it were mist. He reappeared instantly on the other side, his relentless pace resuming. He couldn't hear her. He was living an endless loop of his last desperate days. Clara realized his spectral existence was tied to his specific failure, reaching the terminus monument on Katahdin. He hadn't just died, he had died short of the finish line, and that failure was the tether binding him to the trail. She started seeing evidence of his final, mortal moments. Near a particularly high exposed ridge, she found a tiny, waterlogged leather patch, the kind used to reinforce old canvas packs. As she picked it up, her hands were momentarily gripped by an unnatural cold, and a flash of memory hit her. The burning pain of lungs struggling against ice-cold air, the blinding disorientation of whiteout conditions, the slick horror of frozen rock underfoot. Elias had fallen here, miles from help, close enough to see the final mountains, but too far to reach them. The patch felt significant, a tangible link to his past. She tucked it carefully into the map pocket of her own modern pack. For the final, brutal stretch of the AT, Elias was her silent, spectral companion. He was always just ahead, or sometimes, unnervingly, just behind, a shadow pushing her forward with his own strained determination. His presence was not comforting but motivating, a reminder that the trail demands completion or it consumes you. When she finally reached the base of Mount Katahdin, the air was crisp and clear, a perfect day for the final ascent. The trail grew steep, requiring scrambling and the use of iron rungs bolted into the sheer rock face. As she climbed, the presence of Elias intensified, the cold patches solidified into strong, invisible currents. She felt pressure on her shoulders, not the weight of her pack, but a phantom burden, Elias's heavy, soaking wool pack pressed against her. He was climbing with her, through her. Reaching the flat, vast plateau known as the tableland, the wind hammered her. It felt uniquely hostile, a roaring gale that carried the sound of the ghost's ceaseless, desperate panting. She saw him then, clearer than ever before, standing on the edge of the plateau, looking up at the final sharp rise towards the summit sign. His spectral body was shaking violently, his face a mask of terror and desperate hope. This was the moment of his mortal failure, the point where the cold and the exhaustion became too much. "Not this time, Elias," Clara whispered into the gale. "We finish this time." She pushed through the wind, scrambling over the final rocks. The last 30 feet were agonizing, her muscles screaming, her breath ragged. She reached the summit cairn, and there it stood, the weathered, iconic wooden sign marking the northern terminus of the Appalachian Trail. Clara dropped her pack with a gasp, collapsing near the sign. She was momentarily alone, the usual summit crowds having thinned out for the late season. The cold that had plagued her for days became immense, focused entirely on the small area around the sign. The spectral Elias was right beside her, leaning heavily on the wooden post, his face tilted up, staring at the carved lettering. Mount Katahdin, northern terminus, 5,267 feet. He wasn't seeing the wood or the paint, he was seeing the completion of a life's ambition. Clara reached into her pocket, pulling out the small, worn leather patch. Her fingers were shaking. She held it up to the sign, letting the brutal wind whip it around. "You made it, trailblazer," she murmured, tears freezing on her cheeks. "The journey is over. You can rest now." As she spoke the final word, the cold vanished. It didn't dissipate, it just ceased, instantly replaced by the benign warmth of the sun and the natural, clear mountain air. The pressing, heavy weight lifted from her shoulders. The sound of desperate, ragged breathing was gone. She looked around the summit. The space where Elias Thorne had been standing was empty. There was no remnant, no trace of the heavy wool or the aluminum frame, just sun on granite. Clara sat there for a long time, the silence immense and benevolent. She realized that by carrying that final tiny piece of his intention to the end, she had offered him the closure the unforgiving wilderness had denied him 40 years earlier. She finally stood, weary but fundamentally lighter. She took the obligatory photo with the sign, a monument to her own epic journey, but also to the spectral companion who had unknowingly shared her final miles. The walk back down was quieter, imbued with the deep peace of a sacred task fulfilled. Clara was Sparrow again, light and free, carrying only the weight of her own gear, but she carried the story of Elias Thorne too, a story of the profound, eternal need for completion. The ghost of the thru-hiker, lost soul, had finally found his way home, not across the veil, but across the final, crucial feat of the trail itself. Ilara pressed her cheek against the ferrous rock, tasting the metallic dust the locals called blood. Blood Mountain, or Cerise Peak as the old maps named it, was not a geological marvel of uniform redness, but a nightmare of fractured strata, eternally stained by iron oxide and, legend insisted, centuries of brutal conflict. The air here was thin, carrying a faint, high-pitched whine that played tricks on the ear. The mountain's notorious silence was not the absence of sound, but the deliberate masking of it. For 3 days, she had evaded the patrols of the Directorate's iron dogs, heavily armored trackers whose loyalty was bought with processed rations and whose vigilance was enforced by fear. They hunted her for the single, leather-bound volume she carried, the remnants of the pre-collapse archives, a book the Directorate claimed contained only seditious lies, but which Ilara knew held the precise coordinates of this place. The silent shelter. The entrance, the maps insisted, was hidden along the widow's spine, a jagged ridge that ran like a scar across the mountain's western face. It wasn't marked by conventional means. Instead, it relied on the alignment of shadows cast during the brief period between the sun dipping below the ridge and the onset of the choking night mist. She settled into a shallow depression, pulling the frayed woven cloak tighter against the biting chill. The oppressive silence was the mountain's first line of defense. No birds, no wind rustling leaves, for there were no trees at this altitude, just the unnerving hum, a static field that seemed to swallow vibrations before they could travel. She unrolled the brittle parchment, tracing the complex astronomical cipher with a gloved finger. The hand of Atheris must point to the sleeping god, she muttered, aligning the instructions with the peaks towering above. As the sun's last rays fractured into spectacular crimson streaks, a shadow stretched out from a narrow spire. It was a crude, elongated finger of darkness. Following its direction, she scrambled across loose scree, her boots whispering over the ground, praying the iron dogs were still miles away, distracted by the fake tracks she had laid near the ravine. The shadow converged precisely on a seemingly solid wall of basalt. There was no visible seam, no handle, no sign of engineering. Yet the archive promised the truth was structural. Ilara located the 3 shallow depressions described in the text. One cool to the touch, one rough, one smooth. She pressed them in sequence, smooth, rough, cool. Then waited, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against the mountain's vast stillness. A sound faint as a moth's wingbeat broke the oppressive quiet, a low, grinding resonance deep within the rock. The basalt wall, covering a space perhaps 10 feet high, didn't swing open. It dissolved. Micro-vibrations shook the stone until the rock face crumbled into fine powder and drifted away, revealing a tunnel entrance sealed by something that shimmered, an energy field or a force veil. Taking a deep, mineral-scented breath, Ilara stepped through the barrier. The transformation was immediate and jarring. The cold, thin air outside was replaced by warmth, humidity, and the scent of fertile earth and flowing water. The silence was broken, but not by noise, by the soft, ambient sound of life contained. She heard the gentle rush of an underground spring, the faint clinking of metal against stone, and, most shocking of all, muffled voices. She was in a narrow, naturally formed cavern, but it quickly widened into a vast, artificially hollowed dome. It was a city inverted, a refuge carved deep into the mountain's core. Luminescent fungi provided soft, steady light, illuminating tiers of carefully maintained hydroponic gardens and small, circular dwellings constructed from salvaged metal and woven fiber. The people of the shelter, the Etheri, were unlike any she had encountered in the war-ravaged plains. They were pale, accustomed to the soft light, and dressed in simple, grey tunics. They were lean, not starved, and their eyes held a profound, unsettling calmness. A figure emerged from the shadows of the nearest structure. He was tall, his face etched with the weary authority of a man who had borne the responsibility of generations. Kyle, she presumed, the protector.
"You have broken the vigil," Kyle stated, his voice a low, steady rumble that seemed to travel through the stone floor rather than the air. Ilara knelt immediately, holding the heavy book forward. "I seek refuge, Protector, and I bring knowledge that confirms your existence and the necessity of your silence." Kyle's gaze flickered to the archive, then back to her. "Our existence is its own confirmation. Your presence, however, risks shattering the silence we have maintained for 200 cycles. We are the ghost beneath the mountain. Ghosts do not make noise."
He allowed her to rise and led her deeper into the shelter. The sheer scale of the community was staggering. They had created an entire ecosystem relying on geothermal vents for heat and complex water filtration systems inherited from the pre-collapse era. Every movement the Etheri made was deliberate and minimized. Children played, but their games were mute. They communicated through complex hand signs and subtle body language. This was the true nature of the silent shelter, a society that had systematically eradicated noise pollution to hide from a world obsessed with broadcasting its power. "The mountain absorbs sound," Kyle explained as they walked toward a central reservoir. "But it also broadcasts energy. For the first 50 cycles we were discovered countless times. We learned that absolute quiet is required, coupled with the natural dampening field generated by the unique mineral strata. The blood absorbs everything electromagnetic, but a foreign presence, a single ripple of sustained noise, can disrupt the balance." Ilara explained her flight. The Directorate was not just seeking the archives, they were seeking the coordinates it contained, hoping to appropriate the shelter's technology, specifically the geothermal power source, for their own tyrannical ends. She told him about the iron dogs, the seismic scanners they employed, and their chilling efficiency. Kyle listened, expressionless, his people orbiting them like silent shadows. "You are the ripple, Ilara. Your conflict belongs outside. If I leave, they will trace my path back here anyway," she countered urgently. "The Directorate is calculating. They know the archive points to a place of power. They may not know where, but they know why the original founders chose Blood Mountain." Kyle offered sanctuary, but under ironclad conditions. Ilara was to enter the quiet, a solitary cell deep within the mountain's heart. She was to speak only when spoken to, and she was not permitted contact with the archives. The safety of the community superseded the value of her knowledge. For 5 agonizing days, Ilara remained in the stone cell. The quiet there was absolute, a heavy pressure that made her ears ring. She tried to communicate with Kyle, explaining that the true defense mechanism of the shelter, described in the final, encrypted chapter of the archives, was not the silence itself, but a localized pulse capable of disabling modern technology within a half-mile radius, a legacy safeguard. If the Directorate found the external filtration shafts, silence wouldn't save them. Cale refused to listen. The Aetheri tradition was non-interference. They survived by being irrelevant, unnoticed, and mute. On the 6th day, the relative tranquility of the shelter shattered. It wasn't a sudden explosion, but a deep, rhythmic vibration traveling through the bedrock. Thump, thump, thump. It was the sound of heavy drilling. The Directorate had found the lower vent shafts. Panic, though suppressed by generations of training, rippled through the Aetheri. A young woman tending to a water purification basin gasped audibly, the sound slicing through the dome's low ambient hum like a gunshot. Kyle rushed to Ilara's cell, his composure finally fractured. "They are here. They are breaching the secondary layer. Your conflict has contaminated us." "Their scanners are specialized," Ilara insisted, rattling the cell bars. "They are targeting the energy signatures of the vents. They will be through in hours. Your silence will only let them walk right in." She thrust the archives through the bars. "The final chapter. Read it, Kyle. The Founders knew the price of refuge. The silence must be broken to preserve the shelter." Kyle hesitated, then snatched the book, his eyes quickly scanning the highly technical diagram hidden beneath the encryption key. It showed the schematics for the Aetherius Pulse, a massive electromagnetic discharge generator designed to overload any external sensors or sophisticated weaponry attempting to penetrate the mountain. "This requires energy reserves we haven't tapped in a century," Kyle whispered, his voice shaking. "It will render every external piece of equipment they carry useless, but the discharge, it will be felt for miles. It will scream." "It screams once and they retreat forever," Ilara pleaded. "Or you remain silent and they enslave your people." Kyle ran out, issuing rapid, complex hand signals to his senior engineers. The Aetheri had lived so long in preservation mode that activating an aggressive defense felt like sacrilege, a betrayal of their core philosophy. Yet the deep, grating sound of the drilling grew louder, closer. Dust sifted down from the ceiling. Ilara was released. She followed Kyle toward the deepest core of the mountain, where the ancient geothermal generators pulsed with residual heat. The air was thick and metallic, smelling of ozone and untapped power. Iron dogs were already setting charges in the outer tunnel, their voices muffled and distorted, filtered through the rock, confirming their proximity. Kyle and the engineers worked with frantic speed, diverting massive amounts of stored energy toward the central activation conduit. Ilara guided them, translating the archaic language of the schematics, her historical knowledge proving essential not as philosophical debate, but as a technician's manual. "The alignment is critical," she warned, pointing to a series of glowing crystals that acted as focusing relays. "If the field is misaligned, the pulse will detonate internally." Kyle took the lead, positioning himself at the central console. He looked out at his people, huddled in the glowing dome, their faces terrified but resilient. He raised his hand, the ancient symbol of Aetherius, the open hand. He took a final, deep breath, accepting the irreversible choice. "Activate!" he signed, forcefully. The moment Kyle threw the main conduit switch, the silent shelter erupted. It wasn't an explosive sound, but a deafening, continuous roar of pure energy. The entire mountain vibrated violently, shaking loose centuries of trapped debris. Inside the shelter, the luminescent fungi dimmed as power was diverted, plunging the caverns into a chaotic twilight. Ilara shielded her eyes as a blinding surge of blue light erupted from the conduits. Outside, the effect was devastating. The Atheros pulse hit the iron dogs with the force of an electromagnetic tsunami. The drilling equipment sputtered, glowed white-hot, and exploded in showers of sparks. The specialized comms helmets of the soldiers screamed with static feedback before going dead. The seismic scanners short-circuited violently. Soldiers, temporarily blinded and deafened, panicked, believing they had stumbled into a geological catastrophe. The roar lasted for 30 long seconds, 30 seconds during which the silent shelter was the loudest, most visible target for miles. Then, as suddenly as it started, the energy discharged and the silence returned. But it was a different silence now. It was a silence earned through deafening action. Kyle slumped against the console, sweat pouring from his brow. The external vents, they're collapsing. The pulse triggered a localized tremor. Ilara, dusting herself off, checked the primary access tunnels via a surviving optical monitor. The Directorate forces were in full, chaotic retreat. Their mission was ruined, their technology fried, and the entrance they had nearly breached was now sealed by tons of impassable rock slide, reinforced by the residual magnetic charge. The mountain had defended itself. Over the next few weeks, the Aetheri faced the complex aftermath. Their isolation was restored, but their certainty was gone. They were no longer merely preservers of the past. They were survivors of a conflict they had actively joined. The tradition of absolute silence had saved them for generations, but the archives, the loud, dangerous knowledge that Ilara carried, had ultimately secured their future. Kale stood overlooking the vast dome, where the children, now fully aware of the outside world's threat, practiced their silent hand gestures with a new intensity. He turned to Ilara, who was meticulously cataloguing the damaged components of the pulse generator. "You saved us," he admitted, the words heavy with the weight of compromise. "But we are no longer purely silent. We have announced ourselves to the universe." Ilara closed the archives, the leather now scuffed and scarred but intact. The mountain absorbed the scream, Kyle. They will report a massive magnetic storm, a natural disaster. They will not suspect a community of ghosts fired a weapon. We return to silence, but we carry the memory of the noise. She had earned her shelter, not through hiding, but through action. Ilara chose to remain within the mountain, accepting the mantle of the Aetheri's new chronicler. She would safeguard the archives and the knowledge of the pulse, ensuring that if the world came knocking again, the silent shelter of Blood Mountain would be ready, waiting patiently in the stillness, prepared once more to shatter the silence in defense of its peace. Elias Thorne did not fear the unknown, he feared the incomplete. For years, the sight of the white patches on modern atlases, those arrogantly vacant voids marked unsurveyed, had functioned less as gaps and more as personal affronts. He was a cartographer of the old school, one who believed that reality, however vast, must submit to the pencil, the plumb line, and the immutable laws of trigonometry. His final obsession was the Cathar expanse. Locals spoke of it with hushed terror, calling it the land that swallows maps. It was a vast geological anomaly, a serpentine knot of jungle and jagged, quartz-veined peaks situated far from any established trade route. Satellite imagery was useless. The expanse perpetually generated its own atmospheric disturbances, a constant shroud of vapor and magnetic interference that rendered GPS systems suicidal. It was, in short, the perfect challenge, the last great unblazed territory. Elias traveled light, rejecting modern reliance. His tools were reliable and ancient, a Troughton and Sims theodolite, a marine chronometer calibrated to Greenwich Mean Time, and a stack of virgin vellum paper. He entered the expanse alone, save for 2 indigenous guides who deserted him after the first week when the sun began setting 30 degrees off its charted azimuth. The initial days were merely difficult. The jungle was dense, the humidity oppressive, the ground relentlessly shifting. Elias maintained his discipline, 3 fixed points surveyed daily, azimuths recorded, and elevation triangulated against the baseline he had established before crossing the official boundary. By the second week, the data began to argue with itself. He recorded a massive granite tor, designated point Alpha 7, on Monday morning. By Tuesday evening, calculating his return route, he discovered that Alpha 7 was statistically impossible to reach from his current location without crossing 3 distinct valleys and 2 significant ridges. Yet his path notes showed he had followed a level, westward trajectory since the previous day. He dismissed it as instrument drift, recalibrating everything until his fingers bled, trusting the steel and glass over his own bewildered eyes. By the end of the first month, the landscape had fully begun its insidious transformation. The River Glimmer, the purported target of his expedition, behaved like a living contradiction. It appeared as a broad, shallow stream one morning, disappeared into limestone sinks by noon, and reappeared miles away as a narrow, turbulent cataract flowing directly toward the source he was trying to reach, a physical impossibility in this mountain system. Elias continued mapping. He had to. To stop surveying meant accepting that the world was liquid and arbitrary. He became a prisoner of his own routine, meticulously drawing contours that he knew, intellectually, could not exist in 3 dimensions simultaneously. His maps began to resemble Escher prints. Paths looped back upon themselves, elevations gained were suddenly lost without descent, and adjacent topographical features seemed to merge through non-Euclidean portals. The isolation deepened until it was absolute. His only companions were the instruments and the whispering air, which often sounded like the rustle of vellum pages turning on their own. He stopped talking to himself and began conversing with the chronometer, a faithful, silent object whose consistent ticking provided the only anchor in a world where time itself seemed to stretch and compress unpredictably. One evening, while setting up the theodolite on a seemingly stable plateau, he made a discovery that shattered the last vestiges of conventional geographic belief. He sighted down the telescope to confirm the position of an established point, Gamma 12, a distinctive, triple-forked tree he had measured 3 days prior. Gamma 12 was there, exactly where it should be, but beside it the landscape had shifted. A massive, smooth-sided column of obsidian, at least 200 feet high, had materialized. It was geometrically perfect, alien, and lacked any sign of weathering or erosion. It was simply there. Elias measured it instantly. He ran his calculations, determining its coordinates, its height, its distance. It was too close. Based on the survey data from Gamma 12, the column occupied space that was already filled by a moderate ravine. He walked toward it, his heart pounding not with fear, but with a terrifying exhilaration. If the map was right, he was walking into a spatial paradox. If the column was right, the map was nonsense. He reached the base of the column. He placed his hand on the cold, polished stone. He turned back to locate his theodolite. The plateau was gone. The ground upon which his tripod had rested, the flat, stable earth he had just left, had vanished. He stood now on a small, crumbling ledge overlooking a vertical drop of several hundred feet. His instruments, his life's work, his meticulously calibrated reality, all were gone. Elias did not scream, he laughed, a dry, rasping sound that tasted of dust and defeat. The jungle had not just moved around him, it had erased his point of reference entirely, punishing him for the arrogance of trying to measure it. His journey became a frantic, directionless scramble, Without the instruments, he became utterly dependent on his immediate perception, which was now thoroughly corrupted. He no longer worried about plotting coordinates. He worried about surviving the next twist in space. He started seeing the blaze marks, not the careful cuts he had made with his machete weeks ago, but new marks, impossibly old, carved deep into the bark of trees that had no business being in this terrain. These marks were not signs of passage. They were warnings. They were lines and angles that did not close, symbols of impossible geometry, a triangle with 4 sides, a circle with sharp corners. He realized then the horrifying truth of the Cathar expanse. The path to the River Glimmer was not hidden. It was created by the attempt to chart it. His meticulous efforts to bring order had inadvertently constructed a personalized, impossible dimension tailored to break the mind that dared to impose logic upon it. The unblazed path was unblazed because the act of blazing it meant carving one's own insanity onto the face of the world. Days bled into a terrifying continuum. He ate roots, slept standing up, and walked without rest. His vellum journal, now useless for surveying, became a receptacle for his fevered philosophy. The ink spilled, the pages warped, the script spiraled into illegible confession. Entry 147, approximate. I see the river glimmer. It flows from a mirror. No, not a mirror, but the absence of light that reflects itself. It is the source of all the white spaces. It is the map I tried to fill. He eventually reached the geographical coordinate where the river's source should have been. It was a clearing, small and silent. In the center, there was no spring, no waterfall, no lake. There was only a depression in the earth, shaped like a perfectly formed open book. Within the depression lay a single, tattered, water-damaged map. It was his own handiwork. The vellum was identical to the paper he had used. The lines, the contours, the precise, elegant script. It was Elias Thorne's map of the Cathar expanse. But it was finished. It showed the entire route from the external boundary to this very clearing. Elias knelt, picking up the map. The detail was staggering, flawless, perfect. It was the complete record of his entire journey. But when he looked closer, he saw the critical difference. The map didn't just chart the physical world, it charted the internal breakdown. The later entries were not geographical coordinates, but descriptions of hallucinations, whispered dialogues with the chronometer, and terrifyingly accurate depictions of the non-Euclidean angles he had begun to see in the shadows. He followed the lines back, tracing his steps to Gamma 12, to Alpha 7. He saw the obsidian column meticulously labeled not as Obsidian Tor, but as the moment of acceptance. The map was not a record of Cathar, it was a blueprint of Elias Thorne's descent. A profound, chilling clarity washed over him. He hadn't been charting a place, he had been charting a psychological state, and the environment had merely manifested his increasing instability. He realized that the map he held was the final map, the one created at the moment his rational mind surrendered. He traced the final line on the map, the last point entered before the descent into chaos. It showed the coordinates of this clearing. Beside it, written in his elegant hand, were the final words. The only true path that remains unblazed is the one that leads out of the map itself. Elias Thorne smiled. He ripped the finished map into 1,000 fragments, scattering the history of his madness onto the floor of the clearing. He closed his eyes, no longer feeling the need to measure, define, or understand. When the small, cautious search party finally stumbled upon the clearing nearly 2 years later, guided only by vague, unsettling reports of a lone white man wandering the impenetrable jungle, they found nothing but the remnants of a decayed camp and a large pile of quartz crystals arranged in an impossible, interlocking geometric pattern. They found no bones, no definitive trace of Elias Thorne, but tucked into the base of the impossible quartz sculpture, they found a single, surviving fragment of vellum. On it, drawn with agonizing precision, was the perfectly rendered silhouette of the Cathar expanse, but inverted. The peaks were depressions, the valleys soaring ridges, and across the entire distorted landscape there was only one inscription, repeated endlessly, meticulously: blazed, blazed, blazed. Dr. Alastair Finch arrived at the Pine Grove Furnace on a late October afternoon, the kind of day where the sunlight filtered through the skeletal branches of the oaks only to be immediately absorbed by the damp, ancient earth. The air was heavy, smelling of cold iron and wet leaves, a perpetual melancholy clinging to the remnants of the industrial past. Finch was not a detective, but a cultural historian specializing in Appalachian folklore, an unexplained ecological phenomena. His interest was historical, the string of vanishment stretching back to the 1870s when the furnace complex was still belching smoke and demanding labor. They called it the furnace hunger. Settlers, charcoal burners, and even passing travelers who simply ceased to be, leaving behind nothing but unanswered questions and often, oddly, their boots neatly placed by the last known trail marker. His current focus, however, was tragically contemporary. Sarah Jenkins, a 22-year-old geology student from Harrisburg, had disappeared 6 weeks prior while conducting soil analysis near the old slag heaps. Her disappearance was the first significant incident in decades, disturbing the long, unsettling sleep of the historical mystery. The park ranger, a weary man named Silas, handed Finch a thick file containing Sarah's last known movements and her recovered possessions, a tent, an empty provisions box, and a meticulously kept field journal bound in worn leather. "No struggle, Doctor," Silas had said, his voice flat. "No footprints leading away that we couldn't account for. The dog teams lost the scent right here, at the lip of the creek where the runoff from the furnace used to flow. It's like the ground opened up and closed again." Finch spent his first days immersed in the journal. Sarah was intelligent, scientific, and initially skeptical of the local legends she'd researched. But her entries grew increasingly erratic. September 12th. The magnetic readings near the main stack are bizarrely erratic, exceeding normal ferrous interference. Almost rhythmic, the air feels thick, it swallows sound. September 16th. Heard a sound today. Not a bird, not the wind. A deep thrumming, like a massive bellows, but slower, deeper than anything human. It came from the pit, though the furnace hasn't run in over a century. Silas says it's the wind catching the stack, but the sound wasn't moving. September 20th. I feel profoundly watched, not by a person, but by the ground itself. The ancient iron ore veins that feed this area, they feel alive, demanding. I found a cluster of quartz near the old tapping hole. The crystals were vibrating faintly. I left my recorder running near the Old Man's Rock tonight. The Old Man's Rock was a massive sandstone outcropping used by the furnace workers as a landmark. It overlooked the most impenetrable section of the woods, a densely shadowed area where the undergrowth seemed specifically designed to snag and hold. Finch left the safety of the ranger station and hiked towards the core complex. The Pine Grove Furnace was more than just a ruin. It was a mausoleum of industry, a vast, cold monolith of stacked stones that had once consumed forests and men with equal hunger. He reached the main stack. It stood 40 feet high, moss-covered and imposing, the throat of a long-dead giant. Walking around the base, Finch felt the peculiar quiet Sarah had described, a heavy, localized silence that seemed to cancel out the natural sounds of the woods. He pulled out his own recording equipment, running a check for low-frequency anomalies. The readings were flat, unnervingly so. The air was simply dead. He followed the faint track Sarah had marked in her journal toward the old man's rock. The trail soon vanished, forcing him to navigate through brittle rhododendron thickets. As he climbed, he began to notice anomalies. Rusting railroad spikes, ancient and misshapen, were embedded in the roots of trees that were clearly younger than the spikes themselves. It was as if the ground was pushing up fragments of its past, defying the usual process of decay and sedimentation. Near the rock, Finch found the spot where Sarah had set her tent. Nothing remained but the depression in the leaves and a few scattered, unidentifiable metallic flakes clinging to the damp soil. He examined the flakes under a loupe. They weren't modern aluminum. They were almost pure, refined iron, yet strangely fragile, like oxidized dust. Then he saw it, a small, almost invisible crevice beneath the old man's rock, leading into a shallow, dry cavern. Sarah had referenced this in her final entry. The sound is loudest here. I think this is where the air is exhaled. He shone his powerful flashlight into the gap. The air inside felt immediately colder, drier, almost electrically charged. The cave was small, barely wide enough for one person. It smelled deeply of ozone and subterranean dampness. Tucked into a cluster of geodes near the back wall, Finch found Sarah's professional-grade recorder. It was switched off, but the storage card was intact. He retreated to the daylight, sitting on the cold stone of the old man's rock, to listen. The recording started normally, birdsong, the rustle of the tent. Then, on September 21st, 03 hours, the sound began. It wasn't wind nor a machine. It was a vast subterranean hum, low enough to be felt in the chest more than heard. It was irregular, a slow, sustained resonance that built, peaked, and then faded, only to begin again. It sounded exactly like the immense, slow intake and outtake of breath. As the recording progressed, the hum grew louder, sharper, until it became an intolerable, sustained pitch. Finch had to turn the volume down, his teeth aching from the vibration. And then Sarah's voice, strained and whispering, overlaid the drone.
It's drawing it in. It's not physical heat. It's consumption. The iron needs the energy, the presence. Her voice dissolved into ragged gasps. The old men didn't vanish, they were integrated. The boundaries are weakening. The recording ended abruptly, with a sharp, sickening clank, the sound of iron striking stone, followed by absolute silence. Not the dead silence of the forest, but an absence of all acoustic energy.
Finch felt a profound chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The disappearances were not acts of violence or misadventure. They were a form of localized, involuntary metamorphosis. He looked around the deep woods. The pine grove furnace, built on dense iron ore deposits, had operated for over 100 years, consuming wood, consuming limestone, consuming the surrounding landscape. It was a monumental transformation of matter, requiring immense, sustained energy. What if that energy draw had never truly ceased? What if the intense, focused industrial activity had created a persistent, low-level thermodynamic or spatial sink? He thought of the old legends, the miners who felt drained, the colliers who left their jobs unable to explain the oppressive weight. The furnace hadn't just made pig iron, it had imprinted a specific kind of hunger onto the landscape. Driven by a grim understanding, Finch returned to the stack, moving past the usual tourist markers towards the oldest slag heap, a massive, forgotten spill of vitrified waste located deep within a ravine known locally as the Devil's Kitchen. The slag heap was treacherous, composed of sharp, glassy black and blue chunks of refuse that sparkled faintly in the dim light. It represented the very end product of the consuming process. Finch scrambled up the slope. Near the crest, he found something that solidified his terrifying hypothesis. It wasn't a body. It was a hiking boot, a modern Gore-Tex boot, Sarah's size and model, recognizable from the police report. But this boot was not lying on the ground. It was half buried in the slag, and the material around the laces and sole had begun to integrate. The hard, black glass of the slag heap had flowed, molten yet cold, up and around the fabric and rubber, bonding with it at a molecular level. It looked like an unfinished sculpture, a grotesque fossil of modernity trapped in ancient refuse. A few feet away, partially visible in a cracked section of the slag, was a glint of metal. Finch chipped carefully at the brittle glass. He unearthed a small, 19th century pocket watch, heavily rusted, its brass casing fused tightly with the slag. Beside it was a partially decomposed fragment of thick woolen cloth. This was not a historical artifact that had been buried. This was where Daniel Thorne, a collier who vanished in 1883, had been absorbed. And now Sarah Jenkins was following the same path. The boundary between the matter of the person and the matter of the furnace was dissolving at this location. The furnace hunger wasn't seeking flesh or bone, it was seeking structured energy, complex organization, drawing it into the endless, slow consumption cycle of the iron ore. As Finch studied the integrated boot, the low, powerful thrumming he had heard on the tape began, not from the direction of the stack, but directly beneath his feet. The ground of the slag heap vibrated, a resonant frequency that was not painful, but deeply disorienting. A thick, unnatural fog smelling strongly of sulfur and damp clay began to coalesce around the ravine walls, rushing inward towards the heap. Finch felt a sickening pull, a disorientation that made the world swim. He wasn't seeing things clearly. The trees seemed to elongate, the massive iron stack appearing simultaneously far away and right behind him. He felt his coherence beginning to fray, the disciplined structure of his thoughts attempting to follow the rhythm of the thrumming earth. "You will be part of the record," an unspoken suggestion whispered into the silence of his mind. "You will remain here, ordered, stabilized." Finch stumbled backward, the heavy recorder falling and shattering against the black glass. The sound of the breaking plastic was agonizingly loud, a disruption in the seamless silence. The violence of the noise seemed to briefly shock the environment. He scrambled down the slope, driven by primal terror, not running from a ghost or a monster, but running from geological stasis, from being permanently incorporated into the cold, historical hunger of the earth. He didn't stop until he reached the relative normalcy of the gravel access road, the thrumming fading into the background hum of the normal world. He looked back at the Pine Grove woods, now shrouded in a deepening purple twilight. The fog was retreating, leaving the furnace stack standing guard, silent and implacable. Finch left the next morning, leaving Silas the fragmented recorder and the account of the fused boot, which he knew would be met with profound skepticism or outright denial. He understood now that Pine Grove Furnace was not merely an abandoned industrial site. It was a slow geological engine of absorption, requiring occasional sustenance to maintain its eternal, cold permanence. He published his findings not in a journal of criminology or even folklore, but in a niche historical review, framing the disappearances as local, temporal, and spatial stabilization events centered on ferrous deposits. He included the historical records, the modern police reports, and the chilling account of Sarah Jenkins' final entry. He never returned to Pine Grove, but sometimes, late at night, in the profound silence of his study, Alistair Finch swore he could still feel the deep, slow thrumming beneath the floorboards, the massive, patient breath of an iron heart that was still, perpetually consuming. The vanishments of the Pine Grove furnace remained unsolved because the solution lay not in finding the lost, but in acknowledging the dreadful, cold permanence of the earth itself.